I always believed betrayal came from strangers. I was wrong. It came from the people who shared my surname, sat around my Christmas table, and promised they would always stand beside me. By the time I turned 44, my wife had left me for my cousin, my parents had welcomed them into the family home, and I was told to stop making everyone uncomfortable. They thought I'd forgive them. They never imagined I'd walk away, and that one decision would change every one of our lives forever. I used to believe that a promise made between family meant something. Not a casual promise. Not the sort you make to keep children quiet. I mean the kind repeated year after year, until it becomes part of who you are. One day, all of this will be yours. My father must have said those words 100 times while we stood together in muddy fields before sunrise. I believed every one of them. By the time I discovered the truth, I had already given my youth, my marriage, and nearly 25 years of my life to a future that had never been mine. The cruelest part wasn't losing everything. It was realizing that the people I trusted most had never intended to keep their promise in the first place. My name is Thomas Bennett. I'm 45 years old, and this is the story of how my own family convinced me to build a life they planned to give to someone else. I grew up on the outskirts of North Yorkshire, where rolling fields stretched further than the eye could see, and mornings always smelled of damp earth and fresh-cut hay. Our family farm wasn't enormous. It wasn't the sort of place that made headlines or appeared in glossy countryside magazines. But to me, it was home. My grandfather, Arthur Bennett, built it with his own hands after returning from military service as a young man. Every stone wall, every barn, every oak tree lining the entrance. He used to tell me that land remembers the people who care for it. As a boy, I believed the farm could recognize my footsteps. Granddad certainly did. While other children spent Saturdays watching football or playing video games, I followed him through fields carrying tools that were usually too heavy for me. He never complained when I slowed him down. Instead, he'd smile and say, "Steady work beats fast work every time." Those words stayed with me long after he was gone. My father, David Bennett, inherited the farm from Granddad when I was 12. From that moment onward, everything changed. The farm stopped being a family home. It became a business. Dad believed every hour should produce something useful. Every decision had to increase profit. Every conversation eventually returned to money. He wasn't cruel. At least not in the obvious ways. He never shouted unnecessarily, never drank, never hit us. His disappointment was far more effective than anger. If he believed you'd failed him, he'd simply look at you with quiet frustration until you started apologizing for things you hadn't done. Mum was different. Helen Bennett believed peace mattered more than truth. Whenever conflict appeared, she'd smooth it over with the same sentence. "Let's not upset the family." As a child, that sounded comforting. As an adult, I realized what it actually meant. Don't question unfairness. Don't expose problems. Keep everyone comfortable, even if it destroys you. Then there was my younger sister, Sophie, 3 years younger than me, bright, funny, confident. She could persuade almost anyone to agree with her within minutes. Teachers adored her. Neighbors praised her. Mum called her our little miracle. Dad called her the future. At first, I didn't mind. I loved my sister. When she scraped her knees climbing fences, I carried her home. When older children teased her at school, I stood between them and her. I genuinely believed looking after each other was simply what families did. Looking back now, I realize only one of us believed that. By 16, my life followed the same routine every day. School, farm, homework, sleep, repeat. While my friends discussed university applications, I spent evenings repairing machinery and helping Dad balance accounts. One autumn evening, my careers advisor asked where I wanted to study engineering. I smiled politely. "I'm staying here," she frowned. "You're one of the strongest students in the county. My family needs me." Those 4 words changed the direction of my entire life. I never submitted a university application, never visited a campus, never wondered what another future might have looked like. Dad shook my hand when I told him, "You've made the right decision." That was all. No hug, no pride. Just confirmation that I'd done what he expected. At 19, I was working full-time beside him. By 25, I was effectively running most daily operations. Suppliers rang my mobile before calling the office. Employees came to me with problems. Customers trusted my judgment. Dad remained the owner. I became the man who made ownership work. Every Christmas, every birthday, every harvest season, someone would mention the future. Dad always smiled. "One day it'll all belong to Tom." Neighbors heard him. Friends heard him. Even Granddad nodded approvingly whenever those words were spoken. It wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. When something is repeated for 20 years, it becomes stronger than ink, or so I believed. "The solicitor wants everyone at his office next Tuesday." "Everyone?" He nodded. "The whole family." Something about the way he avoided my eyes unsettled me. As I drove home that evening, Emma noticed my silence almost immediately. "What happened?" I told her about the meeting. She smiled reassuringly. "It's probably just paperwork." I wanted to believe her. Instead, I found myself remembering something Granddad once told me while repairing a broken fence. "The truth has a funny habit, Tom. It always waits until people think it's buried." I didn't know it then. But the meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday wouldn't simply reveal forgotten paperwork. It would expose a promise that had never truly existed. And before the week was over, I would begin questioning every sacrifice I'd ever made for the people I called family. The drive to the solicitor's office should have taken 45 minutes. It took me nearly an hour and a half, not because of traffic. Because every few miles I found myself wondering why my grandfather's estate was suddenly being discussed again after almost 4 years. Probate had been completed, the farm had continued operating, taxes had been paid. As far as I knew, everything had been settled. Yet the tone in my father's voice the previous week had stayed with me. He hadn't sounded confused. He'd sounded nervous. Emma reached across the center console and rested her hand gently on mine. "You're overthinking it. I know. You've been doing that since Thursday." "I know," she smiled. "Whatever this meeting is about, we'll deal with it." I looked at her and forced a smile. She had always been able to calm me. It was one of the many reasons I'd fallen in love with her. But even she couldn't settle the strange feeling growing in my chest. Some instincts arrive quietly. They don't shout. They simply refuse to disappear. The solicitor's office sat inside a converted Georgian townhouse overlooking the market square. Granddad had used the same firm for decades. Everyone in our family trusted them. As Emma and I walked through the front door, I noticed something unusual. Everyone had already arrived. My father stood beside the reception desk speaking in hushed tones with Mr. Harrison, the senior solicitor. My mother sat stiffly in one of the waiting chairs, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. Sophie was scrolling through her phone as though she'd rather be anywhere else. When she saw me, she smiled brightly. "There he is." I hugged Mum first. She held on a little longer than usual. "You all right?" I asked. Of course, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Dad shook my hand. His grip felt colder than normal. "Let's get this over with." Not exactly the words I'd expected. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "If everyone would follow me, please." We entered the largest meeting room in the building. A long oak table filled the center. Folders had already been placed in front of each chair. Mine was thicker than everyone else's. I frowned but said nothing. Once the door closed, Mr. Harrison removed his glasses. "Thank you all for coming. As you're aware, Arthur Bennett's estate was administered several years ago." He paused. "Recently, during the closure of archived property records, additional documents were discovered." Dad shifted slightly in his chair, almost imperceptibly. "But I noticed." Mr. Harrison continued. "Those documents require clarification before the estate can be considered fully resolved." Sophie sighed dramatically. "Can we skip the legal language? I have a train back to London." Nobody laughed. The solicitor opened a leather folder. "The matter concerns ownership instructions relating to Bennett Farm." I sat forward. Emma glanced at me. The room suddenly felt smaller. Mr. Harrison looked directly at my father. "Mr. Bennett, would you prefer I explain, or would you?" Dad stared at the polished tabletop. "You explain." Something inside me tightened. The solicitor nodded once. Approximately 18 months before Arthur Bennett passed away, he signed an updated memorandum expressing concerns about the future management of the farm. I frowned. "Updated? Yes. I've never heard about this." "No," Mr. Harrison replied carefully. "You wouldn't have." Dad still hadn't looked at me. Mr. Harrison continued. "The memorandum wasn't a replacement will. It was guidance intended to accompany the existing estate." He opened another document. "Arthur believed the farm should remain operational for future generations." I smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like Granddad. Then the solicitor continued. "However, he also expressed concern that prolonged uncertainty within the family could threaten the business." I looked around the room. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted, almost as if everyone except me already knew where this conversation was heading. Mr. Harrison adjusted another page. There was also correspondence regarding future leadership. Leadership. I exchanged a quick glance with Emma. She looked just as confused. Finally, I asked, "What exactly does this have to do with today?" The solicitor answered quietly. "Everything." He slid several papers across the table. I recognized Granddad's handwriting immediately. Strong, neat, unmistakable. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen it since the funeral. "The memorandum," Mr. Harrison explained, "states that Arthur wished operational responsibility to remain with the family member most committed to preserving the land." I almost smiled. There was no question who that was. I'd worked that farm since childhood. Every employee knew it. Every neighbor knew it. Even Sophie would admit it. Then the solicitor reached the final page. "The difficulty," he said carefully, "is that an additional document was submitted 6 months later." Dad finally closed his eyes. My stomach dropped. "What additional document?" No one answered. Mr. Harrison placed another sheet beside the first. This one wasn't handwritten. It was typed, witnessed, signed, and it changed everything. "The later declaration recommends transferring ownership authority to Sophie Bennett." For a moment, I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. "I'm sorry," I looked around the table. "What did you just say?" "The declaration recommends Miss Bennett as principal beneficiary of Bennett Farm." The room fell silent. I turned towards my sister. She looked uncomfortable. Not surprised, just uncomfortable. Then I looked at Dad. He still refused to meet my eyes. "When did this happen?" His answer barely rose above a whisper. "About 6 months before your grandfather died." "You knew?" "Yes." "Mum," she nodded slowly. Tears already forming. "You knew too?" Another nod. I laughed once, not because anything was funny, because my brain hadn't caught up with reality. "So," I looked from one face to another. "You've both known for 4 years?" Nobody answered. Emma spoke before I could. "Why wasn't Thomas told?" Dad finally looked up. "It wasn't the right time." "The right time," I repeated. "I've been running this farm every single day. I gave up university. I built new supplier contracts. I modernized the dairy. I paid off equipment loans, and you didn't think the right time had arrived? Sophie leaned forward. Tom, I held up my hand. No, you don't speak yet. She looked down immediately. Mr. Harrison interrupted gently. I think it's important everyone understands something. This declaration wasn't automatically binding. I looked towards him. What does that mean? It means it created legal uncertainty. The will and the declaration don't fully agree. So who owns the farm? He hesitated. At present, your father. The words echoed strangely. Dad still owned everything. Not me, not Sophie, everything. The meeting wasn't about inheritance, it was about succession. And suddenly the last few years made frightening sense. The strange questions, the awkward conversations. The hints about doing something different with my life. They hadn't been casual remarks. They'd been preparation for removing me. I stood slowly. I need some air. Nobody tried to stop me. Outside, the square bustled with ordinary life. People carrying shopping bags, children chasing pigeons, a bus pulling away from the curb. The world hadn't changed. Mine had. Emma joined me a minute later. You okay? I stared across the market. No. She slipped her arm through mine. We'll figure it out. I don't even know what it is anymore. She squeezed my hand. We start by asking questions. She was right, questions. Because one refused to leave my mind. If Granddad truly wanted Sophie to inherit, why had he spent 20 years telling everyone something completely different? And if he hadn't, who had persuaded him to change his mind? Back inside the meeting room, voices had become louder, not shouting, arguing. When Emma and I returned, the atmosphere had shifted. Mr. Harrison was gathering papers. Dad looked exhausted. Mum was crying openly now. Sophie sat frozen in her chair. The solicitor looked at me. There is one final matter. I remained standing. What is it? He reached into a separate file drawer. This wasn't found with the declaration. It was discovered somewhere else entirely. He held up a sealed envelope. Yellowed with age. My grandfather's handwriting covered the front. Across the center in neat blue ink were 6 words. For Thomas, open only if necessary. The room fell completely silent, and for the first time that morning, I saw genuine fear in my father's eyes. No one moved. The envelope lay on the polished oak table as though it weighed 100 pounds instead of a few sheets of paper. My grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable. The same neat, careful script he'd used to label every tool in his workshop. The same handwriting that had taught me how to form my own letters when I was 5 years old. For Thomas, open only if necessary. I looked at Mr. Harrison. What does if necessary mean? He folded his hands. I believe today qualifies. My father stood so suddenly his chair scraped across the floor. I don't think that's appropriate. Mr. Harrison turned towards him. With respect, Mr. Bennett, your father left explicit instructions. This letter was to remain sealed unless there was a dispute concerning the future of the farm. Dad's jaw tightened. There isn't a dispute. I looked at him. There wasn't one until you kept this from me for 4 years. The room fell silent again. Mr. Harrison carefully broke the old wax seal and unfolded 3 handwritten pages. He didn't begin reading immediately. Instead, he looked directly at me. Your grandfather requested these words be read exactly as written. I nodded. He began. If you're hearing this letter, Tom, then something has gone wrong. Those were the first words. Simple, direct, exactly how Granddad spoke. I've spent most of my life believing that honesty solves more problems than it creates. If this letter is being read, it means honesty has failed somewhere along the line. I swallowed hard. The room seemed to disappear. For a moment, it felt as though Granddad himself was sitting beside me again. You always believed the farm belonged to the family. That's true. But I hope you understand something I learnt too late. A farm isn't just land. It's responsibility. Mr. Harrison paused only long enough to turn the page. Whoever owns these fields should leave them healthier than they found them. If they cannot promise that, they shouldn't own them at all. I felt Emma gently squeeze my hand beneath the table. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Several years ago, a development company approached me with an offer to buy most of the southern fields. They wanted to build nearly 200 luxury homes. I looked sharply at my father. He stared straight ahead. I refused, the solicitor continued. The money would have made every member of this family wealthy, but the village would have lost farmland that has fed local people for generations. I could almost hear Granddad's voice. Calm, certain. The company didn't leave quietly. They returned again and again with larger offers. Eventually, someone closer to home started agreeing with them. The words hung in the air. Someone closer to home. I didn't need to guess who. Mr. Harrison continued. Your father believes selling land is practical. I believe some things are worth more than money. We never settled that argument. Dad closed his eyes. For the first time, I saw regret on his face. Not anger, regret. The letter went on. To make sure the land could never be developed without overwhelming agreement, I entered into a private conservation covenant with the Yorkshire Land Trust. I frowned. A conservation covenant. I'd never heard those words before. Mr. Harrison lowered the paper. This is why I asked everyone to attend today. He opened another folder. The covenant was registered shortly before Arthur's death, but due to an administrative error, it wasn't correctly linked to the estate documents. He slid a map across the table. Almost half the farm was shaded green. What does this mean? I asked. It means, he replied carefully, those fields can never be used for housing or commercial development. Dad looked up immediately. Never, not without approval from the trust. And they won't approve it. The solicitor shook his head. They've already confirmed they intend to preserve the land permanently. A strange silence settled over the room. Then something clicked in my mind. I turned slowly towards my father. "You wanted to sell it?" He didn't answer. "You've wanted to sell it for years." Still nothing. Mum finally spoke. "We thought it would secure everyone's future." I looked at her. "By destroying everything Granddad spent his life protecting?" Tears rolled down her face. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "No," my voice remained calm. "Then how was it supposed to happen?" Neither of them answered. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "There's more." I looked back at him. "The covenant also names a steward." "A steward?" He nodded. "Someone responsible for ensuring the land is managed according to Arthur's wishes." My heartbeat quickened. "Who?" He smiled faintly. "You." The room seemed to stop. Dad stared at the document. Sophie looked genuinely shocked. Emma covered her mouth. "The stewardship isn't ownership," Mr. Harrison explained, "but it gives you legal authority over conservation decisions concerning the protected land." I couldn't speak. Granddad hadn't left me ownership. He'd left me responsibility, exactly as he'd always taught me. The meeting ended an hour later. Nobody said very much. Dad left first. Then Mum. Sophie followed a few minutes later, quietly apologizing before she walked out. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I honestly didn't know." For the first time that day, I believed someone. She looked frightened rather than guilty, as though she'd just realized she'd been part of something much bigger than herself. Emma and I remained behind. Mr. Harrison handed me copies of every document. "You'll want to read these carefully." "I will." He hesitated. "Thomas, your grandfather trusted your judgment. I hope I deserve that." "I believe you do." That evening, Emma and I sat on the farmhouse porch watching the sun disappear behind the western fields. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, she broke the silence. "So your grandfather protected the land?" "Yes. But why hide the letter?" I stared across the fields. "I don't think he was hiding it. I think he hoped nobody would ever need to read it." She nodded slowly. "And now," I looked at the folder resting beside my chair, "I think this is only the beginning." Because one question still hadn't been answered. If my father had spent years planning to sell the land, who had he promised it to? And why did someone keep driving slowly past the farm every evening in a black Range Rover that none of us recognized? Something was still coming. I could feel it. And this time, it wasn't just my family's future at stake. It was the future of everything my grandfather had spent a lifetime protecting. The black Range Rover came back the next evening. Then the evening after that, always at roughly the same time. It never stopped outside the farmhouse. It simply slowed as it passed the front gate before disappearing around the bend towards the main road. The first 2 times I told myself it was coincidence. By the 4th evening I knew it wasn't. Emma noticed it too. "That's the same vehicle, isn't it?" I nodded. "It is." "Do you think they're watching the farm?" "I don't know," but deep down I already suspected the answer. The following Monday, I returned to the farm before sunrise. For years, walking the fields had been part of my routine. It gave me time to think before the day's work began. That morning I wasn't thinking about crops or machinery. I was thinking about my grandfather's letter. He hadn't simply protected the land. He'd anticipated that someone might try to profit from it after he was gone. That meant the disagreement with my father had been far more serious than anyone had admitted. As I reached the southern fields, I noticed fresh tire tracks leading through one of the gates. No machinery had been scheduled there. Someone had entered the land over the weekend. I followed the tracks until they ended near the old stone barn. There, half hidden beneath a loose wooden pallet, was a bright orange survey marker. Not one of ours. A developer's survey peg. My stomach tightened. Someone had begun measuring land they didn't own. By mid-morning, I drove straight to Mr. Harrison's office. He examined the photographs I'd taken. His expression darkened. "These aren't agricultural markers." "I thought so." He leaned back in his chair. "Has anyone given permission for surveyors to enter the property?" "Not me. And certainly not my grandfather." He nodded slowly. "I think it's time you knew the full story." He unlocked a filing cabinet and removed another folder. "This arrived from the Yorkshire Land Trust after last week's meeting." Inside were copies of letters dating back almost 8 years. Each one documented offers from a property company called Ashcombe Developments. The offers started at £2 million. They climbed steadily over the years. By the final letter, the figure exceeded £9 million. I stared at the number. £9 million, enough to change anyone's life. "There was one condition," Mr. Harrison said quietly. "What condition?" "The land had to be free of conservation restrictions." I looked up. "So they couldn't build while Granddad's covenant existed?" "Correct." I frowned. "Then why keep trying?" He slid one final document across the desk. "They believed the covenant could eventually be overturned." "How?" He looked directly at me. "If the family agreed to challenge it together." The room fell silent. Together, that explained everything. If enough beneficiaries supported redevelopment, Ashcombe believed they could persuade a court that the covenant no longer reflected the family's wishes. And suddenly my father's behavior made perfect sense. He didn't need me to inherit. He needed me out of the way. That afternoon, I asked Dad to meet me at the farm. He arrived just before 5. He looked older than he had a week earlier. We stood beside the machinery shed where we'd repaired tractors together for nearly 20 years. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, I held up the survey marker. "Care to explain this?" He looked at it for several seconds. "I wondered when you'd find one." "So you knew?" "Yes." "Did you invite them onto the land?" He sighed. "Yes." I felt a wave of disappointment more than anger. "Why?" He looked across the fields. "Because farming isn't what it used to be. I know that. You don't understand. No, I replied evenly. I understand perfectly. You saw money. I saw survival. There wouldn't be a farm left to survive. He shook his head. You think sentiment pays wages? No, but neither does destroying everything your father built. His shoulders slumped. For the first time in my life, he looked tired rather than stubborn. They offered enough money to guarantee security for generations. And what would those generations inherit? He frowned. What do you mean? Concrete. Silence. The farm would disappear. So would Granddad's legacy. Dad rubbed his forehead. You sound just like him. I hope I do. That evening, Mum knocked on our front door. She wasn't carrying food or flowers, just an old wooden box. I found this in the loft. Inside were dozens of photographs. Granddad teaching me to drive the old tractor. Granddad and me repairing dry stone walls, harvest festivals, Christmases, years of memories. At the bottom lay a faded notebook. It belonged to Granddad. Most of it contained crop records, weather observations, livestock notes. Then near the back, I found a short entry dated only months before his death. Tom doesn't know it yet, but he's already become the steward this place needs. Ownership can be transferred. Character cannot. I closed the notebook slowly. Mum watched me. He loved you very much. I know, she wiped her eyes. We should have told you. Why didn't you? Her answer came almost as a whisper. Because your father believed there was only one chance to save the farm. And you believed him, she nodded. I didn't want to lose our home. I looked around the kitchen. You've nearly lost something far more valuable. 3 days later, Ashcombe Developments requested a formal meeting with the family. They still believed a deal might be possible. I agreed to attend, not because I intended to sell, because I wanted to hear exactly what they thought they were buying. As I parked outside the hotel where the meeting was being held, Emma reached for my hand. You don't have to fight everyone. I smiled gently. I'm not fighting. What are you doing? I looked through the windscreen at the conference room waiting inside. For the first time in my life, I'm deciding what my future looks like. And this time no one else would decide it for me. The hotel conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee. Everything about it felt temporary, clean, adjustable, a place designed for decisions that could be reversed later if the price changed. I sat at one end of the long table. Across from me were 3 representatives from Ashcombe Developments. At their center, a man in a tailored gray suit slid a folder forward as though he'd done it 1,000 times before. Mr. Bennett, he said smoothly, we appreciate you agreeing to meet. We understand emotions are involved. They are, I replied. He smiled as if that was expected. But we're not here for emotions. We're here for opportunity. He opened the folder. Maps, figures, rendered images of houses that didn't exist yet but already looked too real. Phase 1 alone would transform your land into one of the most desirable residential developments in the county. He tapped the page. 720 homes, green spaces, community facilities, a net benefit for everyone. I listened quietly, not because I was interested, because I wanted to hear how they justified erasing something they had never understood. Emma sat beside me, still and focused. My father was on my other side. He hadn't spoken since we entered the room. The developer continued. And of course the financial terms remain unchanged. 9.4 million distributed according to inheritance structure. It would secure your family's future beyond question. He looked at me. All that's required is agreement to proceed with challenging the covenant. There it was again. The same idea dressed in new language. Agreement, unity, family decision. As if pressure shared was somehow less destructive, I leaned back slightly. You've done your homework, I said. He nodded confidently. We always do. Then you already know about the covenant. A pause. Yes, he admitted, but covenants can be challenged when all beneficiaries consent. My father shifted beside me. I felt it before I saw it. That old instinct of his. The one that always appeared when money was mentioned. But something was different now. He didn't speak. Not yet. I opened my own folder and placed it on the table. Inside were copies of everything Mr. Harrison had given me. The covenant documents, the legal confirmation from the land trust, the final certification stamped and undeniable. I slid it forward. This, I said quietly, is already legally binding beyond alteration without approval from the trust. The developer glanced at it. Then again. A third time. His expression didn't change much, but something in his eyes did. A recalculation. That can't be correct, he said. It is. He turned a page faster now, then stopped. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than words. Finally, he leaned back. This wasn't disclosed to us. I know, my father exhaled slowly. For the first time since this began, he looked directly at me. You knew, he said. Yes. You knew all of this time? I found out when you did, I replied. But I understood it faster than you wanted me to. Silence. The developer closed the folder gently. So, he said carefully, you're saying the land cannot be developed? No, I corrected. I'm saying it was never available to sell in the first place. The words settled like dust. For the first time since I'd walked into that solicitor's office, I saw something close to clarity in my father's face. Not anger, not defense. Understanding, the kind that arrives too late to change the past, but just early enough to stop it repeating. He spoke quietly. So all these years? He didn't finish. I didn't need him to. The developer looked between us. I assume this meeting is concluded then. I nodded. It is. They gathered their papers quickly, too quickly. Businessmen rarely liked leaving empty-handed. When the door closed behind them, the silence that remained wasn't empty. It was final. Emma exhaled slowly. That went better than I expected, she murmured. It wasn't about going well, I said. It was about ending. My father stayed seated for a long time after that. Eventually he spoke. I didn't know the covenant existed. I looked at him. You knew enough. He didn't argue. That surprised me more than anything. I thought I was doing the right thing, he said. I know. His hands rested on the table. For years I thought survival meant adaptation, that everything had a price if the offer was high enough. He shook his head slightly. I forgot some things aren't meant to be sold, only cared for. I didn't respond immediately, because apologies don't fix damage like that. But they do mark a turning point, and this felt like one. Sophie arrived later that evening. She had driven down from London without telling anyone. When she walked into the farmhouse kitchen, she didn't sit down immediately. She just looked around as though seeing it properly for the first time. I got the call, she said. I assumed it was already decided. No, I replied. It was never yours to decide alone. She nodded slowly, then surprised me. I don't want it sold. Dad looked up sharply. Sophie continued. I know what it sounds like, but I've been thinking since that meeting at the solicitor's. She looked at me. If this place disappears, we don't just lose land, we lose every version of ourselves that ever mattered here. Silence again, different this time, less heavy. More honest, Emma broke it gently. So what happens now? All eyes turned to me. I had asked myself that question 100 times, but the answer hadn't changed. We stop treating the farm like something that needs to be saved by selling it, I said. We start treating it like something that needs to evolve. Dad frowned slightly. Evolve how? I looked out the kitchen window. Beyond it lay the same fields my grandfather once believed could remember footsteps. We make it work without destroying it. The months that followed were the hardest I had ever known. Harder than childhood expectations. Harder than years of silent pressure. Harder than betrayal. Because rebuilding something doesn't begin with agreement. It begins with letting go of old versions of everyone involved. Dad stepped back from daily control. Not entirely, but enough to stop his decisions shaping every outcome. That alone changed everything. Sophie stayed longer than anyone expected. She didn't become a farmer, she became something else. A bridge between ideas and tradition, between caution and change. Emma led the architectural planning for diversification. Not buildings that erased the land, but ones that belonged to it. Small farm stays, education barns for school visits, a local produce workshop that brought people in without overwhelming the fields. And me, I stopped waiting for permission to lead. For the first time, I made decisions not based on what had been promised, but on what was right. The farm didn't become wealthy overnight. It became stable, then resilient, then slowly something closer to alive again. One spring morning, nearly a year later, I stood at the edge of the southern fields. The same fields that had once been marked for demolition. Now they were quiet again, not empty. Quiet in the way places are when they are finally left alone to breathe. A group of local schoolchildren gathered beside me. They each held a young oak sapling. Emma stood a little further back watching, so did Sophie, even my father. No speeches were made, no announcements, just digging, planting, soil under fingernails. The simple act of adding something to the land instead of taking from it. One of the children looked up at me. Will these trees grow big? Yes, I said, if we let them. He nodded seriously as if that made perfect sense. When the last sapling was in the ground, I stepped back. The wind moved across the field, soft, unrushed. Emma came beside me. You did it, she said quietly. I shook my head once. No, I replied. We did. Behind us, my father watched the field for a long time. Then, without looking away, he said something I never thought I would hear from him. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. I didn't answer immediately. Because forgiveness isn't a single moment, it's a direction. Finally, I said, then don't waste what comes next. He nodded once, not as a father, not as an owner, but as someone finally learning how to belong to something instead of controlling it. As we walked back toward the farmhouse, the sky began to change color. The same land my grandfather once protected now carried something new. Not ownership, not promise, but continuity. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough.